This is part two of the study on Elijah, and we stop at this section here, pride dealt with, and read 1 Kings 19, verse 9 to 11. And again, we said in the previous chapter that previous section that one of the things that was recurring with Elijah's life was there was always, and the word of the Lord came to him. And in chapter 18, in chapter 19, in the beginning, we saw that that didn't happen, so Elijah panicked. So he wanted to die, and we were talking about his pride. So this is where we are now, if you were following the previous chapter. So God asked Elijah, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah replies, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty, and the Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with a sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." And the Lord said, "Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by." That verse 11 itself is worth of studying. At some point, we'll do that. Now, the highlighted words above show that Elijah still thought of himself more highly than he ought to. And the Lord dealt with it. So let's see how God dealt with Elijah's pride. Let's go to the next slide. And we say pride dealt with and more. Now, in 1 Kings 19, we read this. Then a great and powerful wind tore the mountains apart and shattered the rocks before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. After the wind, there was an earthquake, but God was not in it, the earthquake. And after the earthquake came a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire came a gentle whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he pulled his cloak over his face and went out and stood at the mouth of the cave. Then a voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" So this is the same thing that was told Elijah earlier, right? And the word of the Lord came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And he said, "I've been very jealous for the Lord, and I've done all these things." And the voice and the word of the Lord tells him, "Go into the mouth of the cave, and the Lord is about to pass by." And then all these things take place. And then finally, there's a gentle whisper, and Elijah goes out, and the voice says the same thing to him. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Now, like I said here, this particular portion of this chapter is very complex. So I don't claim to quite understand everything that's taking place here, but there's one thing that I know is that God hates pride, and because he hates it, he won't allow his children to be proud. So Elijah may have had a successful ministry, but make no mistakes about it. God did not approve of certain behavior patterns that he showed. And I talked about that earlier when he was taunting the prophet and when he kept saying, um, uh, is he sleeping? He was talking, referring to Baal. You see, and then he kept saying, thinking of himself more highly than he ought to. He thought he was better than the other people. So the powerful wind and the earthquake and the fire were all caused by God. But God chose not to be part of it, or he didn't speak through them. So Elijah at that point, I believe, understood exactly what the Lord was trying to teach him. God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble. Jesus himself is the epitome of humility. And remember what he said in Matthew 11 and 28 to 30, right? "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Elijah was taught that the way of God is the way of love through humility. You see, he didn't hear from God and panic because God was teaching him a lesson in humility. And let's look at the next set of verses so you can understand what God is really trying to say. Because Elijah was still very sold on the idea of his own greatness. So the voice said to him, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Same statement made by the word of the Lord, which is Jesus. He replied, "I've been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with a sword. I'm the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too." And let's listen to what God told him in verse 18 of that chapter 19. God says, "Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal, and whose mouths have not kissed him." You see, the thing is this, Elijah was so sold on his own greatness that he could not see past that. Like he still thought of himself as, "I've been very zealous for the Lord. I've been very doing this for the Lord. I'm the only one left. I'm doing this. I'm doing that. I. And he forgot one thing. See, Elijah understood what God was teaching him at that moment. God basically told him, by the way, you are not the only one serving me. There are 7,000 folks whom you know nothing about that I, the Lord, have reserved. And that's the key word, reserved. The Lord is the one who works in us and through us. He gives us the faith to believe, and he also maintains that faith in us. And Elijah forgot that. The minute Elijah said, I'm the only one left, I've been very zealous, he was putting the focus on himself, thinking, I'm doing all this thing because of my own strength. And God had to strip him away of all his pride. He has to strip all the pride away to show him, you're only doing all these things that you're doing because I'm doing it through you. And Elijah had forgotten that. He had forgotten that God was working through him and in him. You know what I'm saying? So let's go to the next slide. And that's my concluding thoughts. Now, first, God hates pride and will not tolerate any equal because he won't share his glory with anyone. Not you, not me, not the president, not anyone. And God's children become proud, he will humble us. That is just a fact. And that's the truth. He will do that. So what do we need to keep in mind? Every good thing that we've ever achieved in our life is because of God. If we believe, it's because of God. If we trust him, it's because of himself. If we do good things, it's because of God. Whatever we do, whether we eat or we drink, whatever we do it because God is working in us. And Paul the apostle understood this fundamental truth, and he said, I am who I am by the grace of God. You see, 3, God is the only one that can say, I am who I am. You know why? Because he is who he is. He depends on no one. He knows all the contingencies, but he's not contingent on anything. We depend on God. We breathe because God allows us to breathe. You see that? Elijah forgot that, and he had to be taught a lesson in humility. Now, another key thing is here. This is dangerous because supernatural manifestations, a successful ministry, do not necessarily mean that God is approving of one's behavior or your inner motives or thoughts. Just because God allows his purpose to flourish through you doesn't mean that he approves of your hidden motives and agenda or behavior. This is why it's important to understand that without faith, without God, it's impossible to please God. You see, you can have a successful ministry. You can do all kind of stuff in the name of God. And God may not be in it. The same way he was not in the earthquake, he was not in the fire, and he was not in the strong wind. You can be very flashy. You can do all kind of stuff. But maybe God is not in it with you. He may cause it, he may allow it to happen for his own purpose, but he may not be in it with you. And, some people have said that passage talks about how we have to stay away from distractions, which could be true also because Elijah heard the voice of God when everything was peaceful and still. Stillness is basically to stop, to desist, meaning take away all the inner thought. Every other distraction must be taken away so that you can hear from God. But it's also, I think the passage was really more talking about his pride. I may be wrong, but I've prayed about it, and I believe, Elijah's pride had to be dealt with. Now, I'll leave you with 1 Corinthians 13 because 1 Corinthians 13 tells us about how we are to live as Christians. And let's go to 1 Corinthians 13. Because if you have all the spiritual gifts and you don't have this element, it's really useless. Paul refers to that in this chapter. He says, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but do not have love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have a faith that can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing. Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It is not proud. It does not dishonor other people. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but rejoices with the truth. It always protects, always trusts, always hopes, always perseveres. Love never fails. But where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part and we prophesy in part. But when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I thought like a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection of us in a mirror. But then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, even as I'm fully known. And now these three things remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of all these is love. And I'll leave you with that. Okay, so if you want, I will invite you to go back and read that chapter again and then think about love and think about how you're living your life right now. Are you being proud? Are you being self-absorbed? And do you think you're doing the things that you're doing because you are the only one left, or you're serving God because you are so special? Make no mistakes about it. Every gift that you have is because of God. So do not boast and do not think of yourself more highly than you ought to. All right? Now you have a good day, and I'll see you the next time.